Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. All right, Bidyan, let's go. Let's do it. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all on this fine fall evening in the East. I'm Joel Whitney. I work with the team that brings the arts and culture events to Brooklyn Public Library. If you're on camera, you can hear me. Great. Nice to see you all once again. We are excited to welcome Tiffany Yanique and Jai Chakrabarty with our series curator and host Anderson Tepper, to whom I'll turn it over in just a minute. I see people are still filtering in. Welcome, one and all. Tiffany is going to be talking about her new book, Monster in the Middle, and Jai is talking about his new book, A Play for the End of the World. We don't have any right to brag about the talent of the authors we bring to this ongoing series, but we do feel proud of them when that talent is recognized. A past panelist that Anderson brought to the series, Damon Galgut, just won the Booker Prize. And what that reminds us is how important it is that we get to live stream these, which makes a video for posterity. And we're excited to report that we'll be live streaming this to Facebook so that you can watch this again later when our two authors win prizes like the Booker, which I'm sure is in the offing. Yeah, I like that you unmuted yourself to laugh, Andy. We are excited to bring these two, and just as a side note, we will tell you where you can follow us. The handle, once again, for our department is BPL Presents, and those are the suffixes on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. My colleague Binyam will drop those in the chat. And I do want to say we've got a good follow-up coming up in a month, and we'll drop that in the chat too. Without further ado, let me hand it over to Anderson. Anderson, as many of you know, is co-chair of the International Committee of the Brooklyn Book Festival and has written for the New York Times Book Review, Vanity Fair, World Literature Today, and Words Without Borders, among other publications. And he's been curating this series with us for a while. And I'm happy to turn it over to you, Anderson.
Thank you, Joel. And it's great to be back in the fall with this series. And it's a special pleasure to welcome you tonight to the program with Tiffany Yanique and Jai Chakrabarty to discuss their novels, Monster in the Middle and A Play at the End of the World, in a conversation loosely themed around legacies and inheritance. So here's Monster in the Middle and Jai's book, A Play at the End of the World. Both novels deal with different ways we learn to love, to create art, to exist and resist in a specific time and place, influenced by what has come before us in the form of family lore and social historical forces. In Monster in the Middle, we explore the very contemporary love story of Fly and Stella, set during the pandemic and Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 in New York City, but also trace its roots back to their parents' own journeys of love and heartbreak, spanning across the US and Caribbean. Who or what are the monsters, the ghosts or shadows that lurk in the middle of their life stories? While Jai's A Play at the End of the World travels from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 to 1970s New York City and India, unraveling a love story between Jarek, who survived the Warsaw Ghetto as a young child, and Lucy, a transplanted Southerner, that is also powerfully shaped by history and linked by a play by Rabindranath Tagore that resonates through these different times and places. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction of the authors, and then we'll have a conversation, short reading, and we'll open it up for questions from the audience on the chat. So Tiffany Yanique is the author of Land of Love and Drowning, How to Escape from a Leper Colony, and the poetry book Wife, winner of the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Fiction, among other awards. She is originally from the Virgin Islands and now lives in Atlanta, where she is a professor at Emory University. Thank you, Tiffany. Great to see you again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anderson.
And Jai Chakrabarty's short fiction has been anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories and the Best American Short Stories. He was an emerging writer fellow with a public space and received his MFA from Brooklyn College. His book of stories, A Small Sacrifice for Enormous Happiness, will come out next year, I believe. Born in Calcutta, India, Chakrabarty now lives in Brooklyn. And welcome, Jai. Great to meet you too.
Great to be here. Thank you, Anderson.
You can call me Andy, both of you. So thank you both. So first, I'll ask you both, tell us about the different places and time periods you cover in your books and how you chose or how you were able to stitch them together. I mean, what were the challenges of writing the sort of books you've written? A novel and stories, weaving together vignettes and episodes. Maybe Tiffany, you can begin because I believe these are separate stories that you've pieced together.
Yeah, this is Monster in the Middle is secretly a story collection. But it's a novel in that everybody's family in the book, and that the arc of the novel is that everybody's leading towards the couple who are at the center, the middle of the book in a way. They're the emotional middle anyway. I wrote these stories over a 14-year period, so it just was a long process. But I did really know early on that they were going to be related to each other, that this was going to be somebody's father, that I was going to maybe like connect this to somebody's daughter. I did have that sense. And I read a lot of novels and stories to kind of see what those were like and help myself understand that form of the novel and stories. I'd written a story collection, I'd written a traditional novel, and I really wanted to see what it might be like to write this kind of thing. But the novel also takes over, I'm turning through my book because there's a map in the novel. I'm gonna show it to you guys. I don't know if you guys can see it. Like, there's a map in the book, and it's a map of America, and it says, the map is entitled Map of an American Love Story. And in the map, I mean, I have little notes about all the different places in the map that the characters are being featured. And we start off in San Francisco, we make our way all around the US, but we also go to parts of the US that we don't often think of as America, like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And I'm kind of thinking through this idea of like, what does it mean to be a person alive in this current historical moment? What does it mean to be an American person? What does it mean to be in love in this historical moment as an American person? And I felt like the geography was really important to answering those questions. And also the history of the characters were really important to answering those questions. So I kind of highlight that by having a map. And the map is like one of the introductory pieces of material to the book. But thinking about the stories as an American love story really also helped me come up with the structure and helped me come up with what order they were going to be in and how I was going to develop the arc, how I was going to link them and make them into a novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jai, how about you? What did you begin with and how did you kind of stitch them together?
First of all, I want to say I love the idea of a map that's stitching together this love story. That's so beautiful.
Yeah, I was also going to ask about the map, Tiffany, because in your earlier book, you also used the map, and I think it's a really great thing, right? In Land of Love and Drowning.
Yeah, I used it. Oh, yeah, look at, there it is. In that novel, it's a map of the Virgin Islands, and It's me thinking through what does it mean to be like a Caribbean person, which I'm both an American and a Caribbean person. So I'm thinking through that in that book. But you know, like for Caribbean people and maybe for Americans or people of the Americas in general, maps are really important to us in our identity, like figuring out where you are, where you come from, who your people are, the connection between you and the land is such a very like important part of what it means to be part of the Americas. Like, who gets to belong here? Who doesn't belong here? When did you get here in the Americas? How did you get here? Is all like a big part of the story of what it means to be an American. So I think, yeah, for both my books, for both my novels, the map is a really important tool to emphasize that.
So Jai, yeah, to get back to you, I mean, I'm wondering where you began this story, and I mean, was the Tagore play at the beginning of it, or was the Warsaw Ghetto story, and how you were able to connect them?
So it does begin with this play, and the novel is centered around this historical event that happens in an orphanage in Warsaw in 1942, where a play by Rabindranath Tagore is performed by a group of orphans. And I was living in Jerusalem with my partner at the time when I came across this act of art and making in the ghetto. And I was so compelled by this confluence of art and the need to come together as community, because it was also a public performance. It brought people together. And so for me, the novel begins there in this question of why was a play performed in the darkest of times, and why a play from Tagore, a Bengali play, in fact, how did it make its way from Bengal all the way to Poland? So I didn't expect to write a book that's historical fiction. Nothing that I'd written before prepared me for this. I thought I was writing a coming of age novel, but it turned out I was writing something entirely different. And of course, the play grounded me. This play by Rabindranath Tagore that was originally written in 1911 and has been performed many times through the years is something that began to unify the book and allowed me to see a structure for the novel.
And it jumps back and forth in time. So was that a difficult thing to figure out, how to move between the 1940s and the 1970s?
So it was important for me to have a really strong sense of the front story, which is happening in the 1970s in New York and India. I didn't want the novel to be overly concerned with the events of Warsaw, because I think in the front story is where you start to get a little bit more dynamism and maybe anxiety or uncertainty about the characters and their decisions. And I think in the backstory, there's a sense of comfort because you already know what's happened. And so it was very important for me to have the front story be the primary vehicle for this novel, and then for the events of Warsaw to be part of this exposition of memory that starts to come out, but which are echoes, but don't take over the novel.
Tell me, both of you, about the love stories that are at the center of your books, Stella and Fly, how they come together, and what are some of the baggage that they're bringing, and in your novel, Jai, the relationship between Jarek and Lucy, and how that is weighed down by the past.
Yeah, Stella and Fly are young, beautiful 20-somethings meeting in New York. Everything should be awesome in their lives. And yet they have what I say in the book is an ancestry worth of broken hearts between them. And we see some of that ancestry in the novel. We meet their parents, we meet them in the earlier parts of their lives, and see how the stuff that they are bringing when they meet each other is like always there. And not only the baggage of their own past loves, but of the stories that have been passed down to them from their parents, and also the things that their parents didn't tell them, the secrets that their parents kept from them, that they were just sort of living in the wake of as they were being raised. that maybe some of it is even in their physical makeup, like things that happened generations ago that they are still now generations later processing, almost like on behalf of their ancestors, which I think is actually true. Like I think many of us are processing things now that began with our grandparents, you know, or I mean, I think what it means to be a person of color in America, we all know that a lot of that means that we're processing racism that happened generations ago, and that we're still living in the wake of. So these characters are living in the wake of that. And there's Stella steals things, and that begins with earlier generations. Fly has some issues with pornography and addiction to pornography, and that begins with his parents too. And that sort of, you know, those things are being passed down from parent to child, and then arrives on them when they meet each other. And they don't know that they're meeting the children inside of themselves, and they definitely don't know that they're meeting the ancestry inside of that other person. But we, the reader, know that because I've set it up so that we're much more aware than they are.
Yeah, and we also see their first loves and
Yeah.
you know their past relationships that they're recovering from.
Right, which for most of us, by the time we're, you know, in our 20s, we have had a broken heart or two of our own, and that's also arriving on with them. Yeah.
Mm. And Jarek and Lucy's relationship, there's a sense that it'll be hard for them to maintain it and even express. It's hard for them to express a lot of the issues or feelings, right?
In
Jarek is
particular,
definitely, yeah.
right. Yeah. I mean, in particular, it's hard for Yarrick to express his feelings and emotions. And I just want to say they meet in the New York Public Library's listening room. So, you know, they're brought together by their shared love of music, and what better place to come together than a library. And, you know, they are an unlikely couple. She's from North Carolina. She's quite a bit younger than him. And he is a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he doesn't talk to her at all about his past. And so, despite the fact that they have an intense attraction for each other, which quickly develops into intimacy, Yarrick is unwilling to share that side of himself, and that becomes a real separation in their relationship. But we as readers do know about his past, and I guess it may be a little similar to how Tiffany has structured her novel there, that we perhaps have a deeper empathy with Yarrick because there's sections early in the novel about his escape from a train heading to Treblinka. But this is knowledge that Lucy doesn't have. And this is a time in American history where education about the Holocaust was not prominent. And so she really doesn't have the context. She doesn't have the opportunity to have that context, but she is still in love with him and trying to find out more about his story.
Mm. Well, both books, as we've said, move around geographically. I mean, they cover a lot of ground. I mean, as you said, Tiffany, around the US and even Ghana, Stella goes to Ghana. But they're both also very rooted in New York City. So tell me about the New York you wanted to explore. Fly and Stella are in Harlem in 2020. Yarrick and Lucy are in mainly downtown New York in the early 1970s. Tiffany, there's a great passage, a little quote that I wanted to read from your book. "It is spring and the night is balmy and they are in New York City, a place fantastic and foreign to them both. New York is actually a place foreign to its own country, as these two are as well." So tell me about the New York that you're describing.
Yeah, I think as we know from like the election, anybody who's been to New York knows, but I think the 2016 election in particular made this obvious. New York is really an outlier in the United States. It's such a strange place, almost like it can either be considered like a microcosm of what it means to be American, or it's actually like radically different from the rest of America. And we learned that, I think, in the 2016 election, when we were realizing like what America actually maybe looks like for those of us who are more focused on the big cities of America, right? So I think, things that happened in New York seem to happen to America, and yet New York seems to stand alone in the United States. So I find that really interesting. New York is a place of immigrants, even people who are native New Yorkers, you just scratch the scratch for one generation and they're from somewhere else. And there's a lot of pride in that in New York too. Like even native New Yorkers are also like, but I'm Italian, but I'm Bengali, but right. So there's a kind of way that New Yorkers are very proud of their otherness. And Monster in the Middle is also about what it means to be an outsider, what it means to like find yourself in a love, in a companionship, but feel like foreign inside of your companionship. And I'm kind of thinking through American landscape as a way to metaphorize that. Like, what does it mean to be an outsider in your own country? And how does that symbolize what it might mean to be an outsider, like in your own family, or to be an outsider in your own intimate relationships, which I think we all feel at some point. Like, my partner does not understand me. This person who I'm in love with is a foreign world to me. And I felt like New York was a really good way to sort of think that through, because we feel a kind of intimacy with New York. It's on TV, it's in books, and yet New York is like endlessly foreign, even to Americans. So yeah. Also, my book is set during the pandemic. I mean,
Right.
part of the book is set there. And New York was also, for a long time in the beginning, the seat of the pandemic. So we were all like watching COVID-19 like blossom in a horrifying way in New York. And it seemed important to make New York also, like if I'm going to end the book, which I did, with the COVID-19 pandemic, because the book is also very historical. I take us through different historical moments in American history. And I wanted to take us through historical moments that were like, all of us were a part of, but we were sometimes a part of it because we saw it on TV or heard it on the radio. And the beginning of COVID-19, we were all paying attention to New York and like watching New York with horror. And it kind of made sense to me to center that in New York too, for that reason.
Tiffany, just tell some of the audience some of the places that Stella and Fly have passed through on their way to New York.
So
their trajectories.
Yeah, we start off in San Francisco, and it's the San Francisco earthquake is the historical moment that drives that passage.
His father.
Yeah, his father is there. We're in Virginia, doing the VTech shootings that happen.
Right.
We go up to Colorado and sort of like visit a little bit of the Columbine shootings. We're in Memphis, and in other parts of Tennessee, where we are being asked to consider MLK being shot. So like, I'm taking people through a lot of different places. We go to Vermont and consider the almost election of a kooky Vermont senator to the presidency. We're in Puerto Rico when our first Supreme Court justice a female Supreme Court justice is being sworn in. So it's not our current court, it's the very first female Supreme Court justice, but it's supposed to be echoing the coming of our Puerto Rican Supreme Court justice. So there's a lot of like echoing between things. But then my characters also land in Atlanta too, where I live now, where we're thinking through a Georgia that is beginning to turn blue, as it in fact did in 2020, politically beginning to turn blue. But we're in Georgia when people are thinking about voting for Obama, and making that kind of consideration. And we're having like people like a husband and wife who are actually fighting over whether they should vote for Obama or vote for Hillary Clinton. So it's in 2008. So there's a lot of going back and forth. What's interesting is that I didn't live in Atlanta when I wrote all of that Atlanta section. So I sort of magically made myself sort of land in Atlanta by accident because I was just coming here to Atlanta to research the book. And then this job at Emory opened up, and then it felt sort of like kismet or something. But there's an assumption probably that I wrote all this Atlanta stuff after I had lived here, but I was actually just sort of envisioning Atlanta and coming here to do the research for that. But yeah.
Were you writing the chapters in a chronological order? I mean, down to the present, or did you write them in different?
Yeah, I jumped around a lot. Like I wrote them when I felt compelled and when I felt most excited about this particular moment.
Right.
The other thing though is that I always wanted to end the book in whatever was going to be the current historical moment, because I wanted my readers to have this, at least the readers who read the book in the first year or two, to have this cool experience of like, wow, I'm living inside the now of the book. I really just wanted that to happen for the reader in 2000 or whenever the book came out. And so earlier versions of the book actually ended with Hillary Clinton winning the election, because that's when I thought I was finishing the novel. And then I had to revise the whole effing novel, and that is not how it went, right? So like a lot of the novel was moving us towards our first our first female president. And then that got unraveled when that didn't happen. So like some of the why it took 14 years is that I had to rethink the now and then think through like, well, okay, well, now I'm going to end with a global health pandemic. And that, you know, I was revising up until like my editors were like grabbing it out of my hands, because I had to think through, well, like, how is illness a part of like the trajectory for all my characters? And for the characters, like physical and mental illness is a huge thing for them, which I think is like a huge thing for Americans in general. Like, I mean, our physical health, the fact that we don't have comprehensive health care, and the ways in which people of color in particular are vulnerable to medical disaster, but also like mental health, which I think is something that doesn't get enough attention in America in general. And I mean, like, I think a product of being an American, and again, I said like the Americas, like having been a product of like colonization and slavery, which is pretty much what it means to be from the Western Hemisphere, is like we're all living in the wake of colonialism and slavery. That's like a mental health like issue, like from the beginning of our inception. And I think like grappling with the ways in which that social reality has impacted us as individuals is also a big part of the novel. So my characters are often like grappling with issues of health, which I like made a bigger part of the novel when we ended in a health disaster like of COVID. Yeah.
Over last summer. And just to go back to New York, I mean, you're in New York. I recognized a lot of the locations, the Lower East Side, Veselka's, Stuytown, Lower East Side. So tell me a bit about, where your book is rooted in New York. And I also, since Tiffany's brought up some more political themes, I wanted to know about the aspect of the violence, the political violence in Calcutta, in particular in India in the 70s, that you also deal with. That period was a very fraught time.
It was a turbulent period in India. So starting with New York, I'm somebody who was born in Kolkata, India, and traveled around to a bunch of different states in America, and then finally settled in New York for most of my adult life. And it was really in New York where I felt a deep sense of home, because there is no place like New York where everyone's from somewhere else. And that fact of everyone being from somewhere else felt to me like a kind of homecoming, like, okay, I'm amongst people who are all seeking lost identities in some shape or form. And so I think for my characters in this novel, that's something that becomes really resonant as well. So Yarrick, who's a survivor of a horrible time, he comes to New York and he can mask that history. He can find in the streets of the Lower East Side a very different experience and be remade by it, which is so common, I guess, in the American aesthetic. And likewise, Lucy, who is a Southerner from a very small town, she doesn't appear that way after living in New York for a certain amount of time. Like, she's transformed by the city as well. And so both of those things are really compelling to me. As far as the political history of India goes, and I know this is a bit of a shift from New York, it was indeed a turbulent time. So in 1970s and in the late 1960s, you had the Naxalite Revolution, which began in the villages of Bengal, which was started with a communist ideology, but really it centered around the fact that villagers wanted access to the land that they were farming, and they were not getting proper remuneration for their efforts. And that movement then starts to move into the city of Calcutta. And by the time Yarrick finds his way to Calcutta in 1972, it's a very politically charged climate. You have college students who are making bombs, who are questioning state authority. And he doesn't realize it. He's unaware of the complexities of Indian politics at the time. But what he's coming into is something that was set in motion several decades ago, tracing all the way back to colonialism and the unmaking of one country from another, of a country trying to find its own feet. And as he's starting to develop relationships with these villagers in India, he's starting to gather the rest of that political history in a more organic way.
And the Tagore play itself becomes kind of a bone of contention, or in the middle of these forces.
Right. So the Tagore play in Warsaw becomes something that brings people together. It brings together much of Jewish Warsaw for this celebratory performance. But in India, it is something that's used as a kind of political protest. And so on one hand, it provides positive publicity for these villagers who are hoping to stake a claim to this land. On the other hand, it invites a lot of negative attention from the government, who are interested in booting them out. So they're kind of caught between two forces, and the play starts to have a very different kind of connotation, a more complex connotation, because, you know, art is not just unary, it doesn't just uplift, but it can also have these other aspects to it, aspects that are potentially exploitative as well.
Yeah. Tiffany, I want to just shift to ask both of you about your lives as writers, or the writing of these books. And so, Tiffany, this is your second novel, highly anticipated second novel after Land of Love and Drowning. So how were you writing in a different register or mode in this book compared to your earlier work? And how do you feel that you've changed as a writer, maybe in your or what you've learned of yourself as a writer, whether an approach to material or form or habits as a writer?
Yeah, I think my themes are always about belonging and about, you know, the tension between the individual and the community. So I think those are the themes that I'll probably be working through my whole career, maybe my whole life. But in this book, I really wanted to think through like the fineness of a beautiful sentence in a beautiful paragraph. And I was really interested in crafting each chapter with its own tonality. So in Land of Love and Drowning, there's a sort of overarching lushness in the language, I hope, in that novel. But in this one, I'm going for something much more like spare and sharp and tight, because I wanted to like have a faster momentum in the book. So it's actually also, for all the time that we cover in this novel, which is from like 1968 up until like just last year, it's a pretty slight novel in its amount of space, like how many pages it is, which is not even 300 pages, 263 to be exact. And I really wanted to just like move the language fast. I just wanted to see that and try that, and sort of just see what I was capable of. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, I was trained as a poet first, so I really care a lot about how sentences move and how paragraphs are structured. And I've thought about it differently in each chapter. So like each chapter is like a new way of me thinking through how language can work on the page, and how like paragraphs can sing on the page, and how like different characters can like move and dance through words. But yeah, it was, for me, I was really experimenting with these different things for each chapter.
Yeah, and Jai, what was the experience for you working on a debut novel? And I'm curious about your stories. Will they cover overlapping ground, or will they be very different?
The stories are very different from the novel. I mean, with this novel, because it covers so many different time periods and geographies, I was always trying to think about what is essential for this novel to work as a coherent piece, and what can I remove, and what really needs to be there. And so there were major characters who didn't survive the revision process. And so for me, it was always kind of about trying to find what are the pieces that are speaking together in this novel, and what are the pieces that are starting to feel superfluous, because it does cover so much ground. I think with the stories, what Tiffany's saying really resonates with me as well, because I too started my career as a poet. And so like that attention to the line, and in general, like trying to let the line guide the narrative, like trying to see what the energy of the line is suggesting for the next beat in the story, is something that I'm always really interested in. And so it's very exciting to me to see how form can start to shape narrative. And I think there's some sections in this novel where that happens. So there's some sections in this novel that are written in play form, and there's some sections in this novel that are written almost as like a zuhitsu, like a Japanese poem form, you know? So when I'm stuck, I go back to the forms of poetry, to the villanelle, to the pantoum, the zuhitsu, etc. And I think that's one way in which I start to work through the stuckness on the page.
And you were saying about the stories, how are they different?
The stories are very different because, you know, there isn't, so they're not a linked collection, they're linked thematically. And so that means for any given story, I'm able to experiment quite a lot in terms of language and tone. And so that to me is super exciting as a writer, because it means I can like try something very different from one story to the next, whether it's playing with point of view, or whether it's playing with pace, or whether it's playing with the tension and the balance of characters. That's very exciting for me as a writer. I don't really want to repeat the same story structure over and over again for 13 stories in a collection.
So how about if we do short readings, if you two are up for it, and if people have questions, they can put it in the chat. Yeah, Tiffany, are you up for a reading?
Sure.
If you need
Yeah,
to
I would love to. I do want to say it's really a pleasure to hear the ways in which Jai and Mai's novels are like talking to each other.
Yeah.
Like the forms, the way that like poetic form is such a big part of the structure. Also the way in which like other literatures are part of the inspiration of the book. For me, like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is an important part of Fly's narrative. But my whole book is also a response to a book by Vivian Gornick called The End of the Novel of Love, which is a book where she very intelligently argues that love novels don't get us to something profound, because we know that love is like not going to be able to do that, or at least not in novels. And I was like, well, I'm gonna see if I can challenge that. I wonder if that's true. You know, I wonder if there isn't a way to highlight the potential of romantic love to actually change and get us to something large. So yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your book, Jai.
Yeah,
And-
Tiffany, I was also going to say your book, some of the chapters begin with quotes by writers, and it was interesting. Jamaica Kincaid is there,
yeah,
Rushdie,
yeah.
Marquez.
Yeah, I actually came up with this sort of fiction form of the fiction Sestina that I base on Marquez's, the first lines of his book, which in some ways was a mentor text for this text. Oh my gosh, my brain is like losing it. But his book about love in the time of cholera, and I used like the first line of that book to write this Sestina based on how Fly and Stella actually meet. So I'm like letting Marquez's lines like help me figure out how my characters fall in love. But yeah, I'm interested in talking to other writers in my book and listening to other writers in my writing. And it's nice to hear, like, I feel like Jai and I were maybe talking to each other on like unaware that we were talking to each other. So I'll read a section that is not overtly political and that is much more emotionally resonant, just so that the readers can hear that part of the book. This is from the very middle of the book, and this is a story that is actually the title story of the book. So this chapter is called Monster in the Middle, and it's told from the perspective of Stella's father. And Stella is telling this, Stella's father is telling this to Stella. So you have to imagine a male voice as I read it. And he's talking to his daughter.
And Tiffany, was this one of the first pieces you wrote?
It wasn't actually. This is actually one of the much later pieces that I wrote, in part because it was like a response to, or it was like a fulfillment of the structure that I had finally decided on. So once I was like, okay, this is my structure, and the novel is structured sort of like a labyrinth where we get to the middle and we maybe meet the monster and fight the Minotaur at the center. And I realized that I actually needed to have the monster in the middle of the book. And so that's where this story actually comes from. But it comes later, as I was thinking through like what was needed for the reader to experience the novel as a whole structure.
And did it give you the title? Did you know that was?
No. My titles come from where, like, I tend to do this thing where I have a title that is just like, in my mind, the subject of the book, and it's not really ever going to be the title. It's just the subject. Like my story collection, same thing. My book of poems, it was just called Wife, because I was just, the subject was wife. And then I call it that for a decade, and the publisher is like, no, that's what it is. I'm like, no, I need a different title. And the publisher is like, no, that's the title. And I'm always very resistant to the titles that I have come up with, because I think the title is just the subject, and it's a subject that was like very personal and metaphoric to me. And I'm like, the reader is never going to care about this title, but every time that has been the title, it sort of ended up being the title anyway. So like my working titles are just ways for me to write towards something. And then at least thus far, and this is my 5th book, so thus far they've just held. And maybe I should just get over this idea that they're working titles and just be like, well, this is the title. So no, the book was always called Monster in the Middle, and then I wrote this story to sort of highlight what actually is the monster. So I'm going to read about what I think is going to be about 1.5 pages, maybe a little bit close to 2 pages. Listen, Data, there is no way to know anything for sure, and thank God for that. Thank God for that New Year's Day, 1968. That day, the monster was on my back. But then again, the monster has always been coming for me. I'm a warm-blooded person because of where my blood comes from, island blood. Thank God for that blood and for that island. But, sweet Stella, I had never been so cold. The monster was in the air. Maybe the monster was going to yam me, eat me, but there I was. I was the kind of boy, and I was still a boy, who would come to wear sweaters in the summers of South Carolina, let my mother kiss my forehead that morning, then climbed aboard a plane. Nothing with me but a bag. One change of light clothes suitable for the West Indies, a toothbrush and a razor. The last because my mother had heard there would be no one there who knew how to cut my black boy hair, though she hadn't thought about my needing a winter coat. And thank God for that long plane ride where I was too excited to be scared and so watched the sky. And thank God for that sleepless bus ride where my sudden fear kept me from rest. Thank God for this St. Thomas boy in a bus, me, not sleeping, but looking out the window as it became winter before my eyes, cold monster. Did I clarify that it was New Year's Day? That the kiss was my mother's last? She was dying of cancer. You know that part already though, right? Sweet girl. Breast. Though no one but me and a doctor over in Puerto Rico knew. I wasn't allowed to tell a soul because sickness of the breast or the uterus or any part of the body we call private, the parts we use to love, to make life, sickness in those parts was a shameful thing. And so I boarded that plane and climbed aboard that bus, maybe heading to my own death, not sure, but feeling also that I'd never likely see my mother again, but still thank God for the burn in my mother's breast before I left. Thank God for her kiss goodbye that let me know it was indeed goodbye. I could tell you more about my mother, your grandmother. I should, for even she is the monster and her mother too. I just want to be plain about how this goes. It's a journey, but you're not alone in it, my love. None of us is. You feel alone, but also you take the journey because you don't want the loneliness. Maybe people go off to war because they want to be left alone, but left alone and lonely, different things those. Me, I didn't want either. Just don't be confused by my life or all of these lives. It's easy really to understand. See, these lives are yours. Have I made it clear that I am so thankful? Thank God for my memories and thank God for the memories that made me, because we can't outrun the monster. And girl, did they make us run that first night. The air like pins in my nostrils. I had a bloody nose before a mile, but kept running because the drill sergeant was shouting and because everyone else was running too, no matter that I was in short pants and air colder than I'd ever known. Thank God for the short pants. Thank God for the ash on my knees that looked like a disease. Thank you for the blood in my nose that bursted out and coated my mouth and neck and shirt and scared the sergeants just enough. That night I shivered so loudly that a bunkmate threw the blanket on me. Thank you, mate monster, generous monster. Thank you, it helped. I slept, but it started again and again. Every morning the blasted running and every night the cold and the sweating in the cold and the sweat freezing me and the letter in the mail before basic was even out telling me that my mother was dead. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you. And Jai, what section are you reading from?
Yeah, I'm gonna so firstly I want to say, like, it's been so fun to talk about the novels and writers that influence our books. In poetry, it's so commonplace to write poems for poets, and it just doesn't happen that often in fiction. And so to have that be a thread in this conversation has felt super fun. And what a lovely section. I feel the voice still sort of like charging through me, hearing Tiffany. So I'm going to read from a chapter called 60 Miles East, and it's fairly early in the novel. It's a scene that is of Yarick, who is escaping the train. And this is told in different versions. So he doesn't have a single version of what happened, but rather starts to develop multiple versions of that same traumatic experience. And over the course of his life, he'll switch between the versions, unsure of which one is the truth. So I'm just going to read about a page and a half from that section of Yarick escaping from the train.
And how old was he? Tell us.
So he's 9 in
He's
this
9.
section. Yeah.
So then the novel jumps 30 years later. So
Yes. When he's 40 years old.
40.
Yeah. And so this is a section that Lucy, his lover, does not have access to. She does not know that he went through this. Sometime between living and dying, the train stopped. It was the moment Yarick remembered more than any other. 30 years, he hadn't grown himself another version. Some memories were like that, bolted and nailed to the mind's eye. You could try to change them, shape them into something they weren't, but you would always be the boy with trousers that reached his ankles, the boy with the tweed cap found by Misha and given special. And the train was stopped now. Who knows whether for a moment or a longer time, and the guards were shouting because he thought someone ahead had jumped. He was holding Chaim's hand, who he knew didn't have the heart to move an inch, and the heat had already burned, and he had already cried, and Ponduktur could do nothing because he was just breathing. He thought, jump. But the rifles had colored the air outside with smoke. Still, he could see it. The window was big enough not only for a cat, but also for him, if only he jumped and squeezed through. Except the train had started to move again. The screams had died down. The soldiers had stopped firing. He looked at Ponduktur, and Ponduktur winked the way he did whenever a mischief had been made, but no one was going to be told because love was that kind of secret keeping. The train had started moving again, but he saw the sun through the window that was big enough just for him. And what spirit launched his body? What ghost slid him forward? Because it was not his 9-year-old bones that did. Still, it happened. He jumped on Chaim's shoulders. He pulled himself up. He went head first, and someone, he'd never know who, pushed his body through the gap. He landed so softly on the sloping hill and rolled so quietly down the field, filled with sharp rocks, holding his pain that no soldier heard. For a while, he watched the train pass, expecting others to have followed, but no one else did. Not another soul had jumped on another boy's shoulders and been pushed into the fields. Was he simply the skinniest, the fastest, or just the most daring of them in that car, the one most willing to leave the others? Now he was alone again in the field of damp and moss. He heard water nearby, and he thought of Ponduktur's face. So much hope, his knees bloody with it, his left wrist bruised dark. So much hope in the wet grass under his palms that when the train gnarled away, the old trees called, and he crawled his way from the light of the sun to the light of the trees. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jai. So when you were doing research on this book, was there any evidence that something like this might have happened? That people
There
had
were reports of folks who had escaped from the trains heading to Treblinka. So in the historical record, none of the children who were part of Janusz Korczak's orphanage, there were 192 children at the time, made it. But separate from that, there were some folks who managed to escape the train to Treblinka. And then there was also some staff of the orphanage that managed to survive.
Well, if there are no questions from the audience, if anyone wants to send a question on the chat. Jai, just speaking of writers, who are some of the writers that live in your book or that influence this book?
Yeah, Jhumpa Lahiri's The Lowland is a book that I read later in the revision process, but she's talking about the Naxalite Revolution.
Right, similar period, yeah.
Similar period, and how the effects of living through the Naxalite Revolution, how that continues to impact someone for decades to come. And I felt like I was researching similar territory. And then there were a lot of books that have to do with memory and how we look at a traumatic event and start to shape it over and over in our lives. So there's Penelope Lively's Moon Tiger that that does this, and then there's The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. And so I was really interested in these books where memory and trauma and how we start to find a narrative for what has happened to us, and start to find a way to live our lives with that narrative. I was really interested in those kinds of books.
And Tiffany, what were the levels of trauma that you wanted to deal with? I mean, were they more personal, or they were also social, historical?
I do want to say, Jai, that reading was beautiful. Just really intense and just gorgeous writing. Thank you for reading it. I'm not sure if one of the things that I came to understand in the decade plus that I was working on this book is that I'm not really sure if there's a difference between social and personal trauma. And when I was in college, we heard this term, if we were all feminists, like, the personal is political and vice versa. And I had a sense of what that meant as like a feminist thinker, but I don't think I understood what it meant as like as an individual soul in the world. And the act of writing this book and doing the kinds of research that I did for this book, a lot of which was like just talking to people about where they were when some things, the historical moments in the book happened, and just realizing that so much of who we are that we think is ours and ours alone belong to our whole generation or belong to our whole nation. Like we think that like who you fall in love with is a personal, private, solitary act. And yet it seems like these things are also like social and political acts too, that have been like coming at you long before you knew what love even was, long before you were maybe even born. Like it was kind of predestined, the kind of person that you were going to desire because of your social, political, historical, racial realities. And I found that really like horrifying, but also beautiful. Like we can't escape our childhood, we can't escape our history, but then it kind of means that we're all in it together. And there's something quite gorgeous and like comforting about that too, I felt. The truth is though, that in my own family, there's a long and complicated history with mental illness, different types of mental illness. And I have been wondering about how to think about that in my own work and how to be open and honest about it in my work. And I've thought about doing it in nonfiction, but I also didn't want to hurt people who might not be ready to be sort of outed in my family. And also it remains like in many parts of my family, like a very painful part of our family history. So I didn't want to increase that pain for people who are still alive. So I thought like a lot of those questions and things that I wanted to think through are in this book, and thinking through the ways in which the mental illness in my own family has like landed on all of us in my generation and maybe in my children's generation. And not that we are suffering necessarily from the illness itself, but like how does having depression in our family, what did it mean to grow up with that inside your household? And how does that impact how you understand love and what you do in your own household? Even if no one in your own household is suffering from mental illness, the history of it is still landing in your household. And so I wanted to think that through. So that is very personal. But I also think that this is, like I said earlier, that it's a political reality, like how we deal with mental illness, why mental illness is such a huge part of particularly the Black community in America. I mean, slavery, right? Like colonialism, racism. I mean, how do you sustain generations of that without being sick? You know, it just seems to me like that's going to be part of our reality.
Mhm. Yeah. The Stella section begins with your quote from Jamaica Kincaid from the autobiography of my mother. The meeting of people and place, you and the place you are from, are not a chance encounter. It is something beyond destiny.
It's so true. I think we often think like, well, this is where I'm from, but I can leave it behind and reinvent myself. You know, I go to college, I go to New York, I do these things, and I'm made anew. And I think Kincaid is very wise, and I really look up to her texts and to her actually as a writer. And I just think it's not true that we ever leave those things behind and really ever reinvent ourselves completely. We always carry where we're from inside of us on our backs. Like, I just think it's always there and cannot be escaped. So Kincaid's books taught me that. My own life has taught me that. And I wanted Stella to desire to escape it, and yet come to realize that she cannot, and that one must actually contend with it, befriend the trauma, befriend the history, face it, work through it. But escaping it is just not realistic. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we'll end, but one last question, Jai. When Tiffany was speaking, I just wanted to ask you about the ending of your book. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but you leave things open.
Yeah, indeed. And I think what Tiffany's talking about in terms of predestination and agency is something that I spent a lot of my time obsessing over, which is to say, like, fiction, I think in general, concerns itself with these moments of agency that characters supposedly have. But I think sometimes we perhaps can give ourselves too much credit, that those moments of agency can actually be traced back to, so many other things that came before, whether it's DNA, whether it's societal forces, whether it's, ancestral trauma. And the idea that there is going to be a definitive choice that gets made, a certain direction that gets chosen, is something that, I, as a writer, have some degree of resistance to. And so that's both speaking to this idea of, my agency and what I ought to bring to the page around that. But then I think the other part of it is, I think it's more enjoyable for me as a reader to have the second beat and to see where the characters are going for myself. Like, that's not something that I want to be told. At this point, reading, 200 or 300 pages, I think I know them well enough in a book, whether it's my book or another, to imagine that second beat. And those are the kind of endings that I'm really drawn toward.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both, Tiffany, Jai. Really, thank you for the conversation tonight. It was a real pleasure, especially to hear you speak to each other and talk about each other's books.
Andy, thank you for having us. This was great. I really enjoyed the conversation too. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thank you, Tiffany.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Joel and Brooklyn Library. And yeah, be well. Talk to you soon.
Thanks all. It was brilliant. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.